Well, you're still here, so welcome back. Welcome to week 2 of History 308. Um, let's just get right into it. This is the video for week 2. This will set you up for the textbook reading and the other readings you'll do for the quiz. And everything in this video is related to the two big questions that are on the quiz due at the end of the week. So more on that later. So in the orientation video for this class, I made the argument that world history did not truly begin until the year 1492. And it's worth repeating that the first fact to be aware of in this class is that the class begins at a point in time in which the population of the planet Earth practically lived in two completely separate worlds. The eastern and western hemispheres of the Earth were separated by two large oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, and the people living in each half had no contact with each other. Both of these parts of the world were heavily populated with civilizations that had deep and ancient roots. Both had developed vibrant languages and cultures, fought endless wars, created religions, had babies, ate food. Millions and millions of people over countless ages lived. Mothers, fathers, farmers, warriors, priests and priestesses, kings and queens, merchants, thieves, scoundrels, and so on. And for at least 15,000 years, people on each side knew nothing about each other's existence. Just think about that. And once they did become aware of each other, as we'll see, it didn't just change the history of the Western Hemisphere, it changed the whole entire world, kicking off a process that we call globalization. Now, we could say that 1492 is the most significant event in the history of the world for this reason. In fact, we might say that it was the real beginning of world history. As far as human consciousness was concerned, there was no such thing as world history until these people finally encountered each other. Now, once these encounters began, historians started calling this period the early modern era. That is, the centuries from roughly 1500 to 1800. And we'll be covering this chunk of world history in the first 7 weeks of the class under the heading in the syllabus, Connecting the Globe, which corresponds with part 5 of your textbook, called The Origins of Global Interdependence. So just keep thinking about all these terms: connecting the globe, global interdependence. You're going to be hammered with these concepts of globalization, and this is where you want to start to figure this out. As these titles indicate, the main theme of the early modern era is the onset or the origins or the beginnings of globalization. Now, there have always been interactions and connections between different regions of the world all throughout world history, in ancient times even. But there are two critical differences between these exchanges that take place before 1500 and the exchanges that take place after. Number one, after 1500, the connection between the eastern and the western hemispheres meant that for the very first time in recorded history, the commercial, technological, and cultural exchanges took place across all hemispheres. That is, they took place globally. Number two, those globe girding networks of transportation, communication, exchange were created by Europeans, were European driven, and they supported cross-cultural interactions that were much more systematic and much more intense than what had been in pre-modern times, that is before 1500. So this, the early modern era, is when and how globalization began. But before we get into that, we need some context. That is, we need some sense of the shape of the world and the balance of power before 1492. Let's imagine that an alien invasion was underway during the 15th century. Invaders from a warlike planet are hovering in space above the Earth, looking to identify the major centers of power to attack. At any given point in the 15th century, the people of Europe would not look like much of a threat. Now, it's true that Europe is going to emerge as the central power in our story over the course of this class, but in 1400 or even 1500, Europe was a backwater in the story of human history, a populated but inward-looking part of the world full of people who seemed to be spending most of their time fighting among themselves. The attention of these aliens would be drawn to much larger and older powers, with Europeans much farther down on their list of priorities. So, the big questions for this first section of this video: what were the major powers in the world before 1492? And more specifically, how would you characterize the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere between the major empires and European societies, and why? This, of course, is the first question on the quiz for this week. So think about this over the first half of this video, write down some notes, and remember in these quizzes, I want you to give as much detail as you possibly can in answer to these questions when you write your paragraph. So don't just simply list the powers. Say something about them. Explain the relationship between those powers and the balance of power with European societies and why. The world economy that we've started examining, the one that defines the process of globalization, was not exactly created by Europeans. Instead, Europeans tapped into and then ultimately subsumed a very old and very vast commercial system centered on the Indian Ocean and dominated by Asian powers. And when I say old, I mean very old. Humans had been building mighty civilizations, blending cultures, and trading across Asia for thousands of years. And over the millennia, great overland trade routes had been developed that came to be known as the Silk Road. Established during China's Han Dynasty between 200 BCE and 200 CE, the Silk Road was a 4,000-mile trade route that spanned the Asian landmass, connecting the trading ports of China to the Mediterranean Sea. It got its name from the incredibly lucrative Chinese silk trade, but silk was not at all the only item moving across this route. Early on, traders in the Chinese ports of Canton bought silk, porcelain, perfumes, teas, sugar, precious metals, and eventually drugs. And over the centuries, the Silk Road evolved into a vast and varied transcontinental highway system, connecting all the major trading centers in the Eastern Hemisphere. Also, there were spurs linking the main overland route to the Indian Ocean, where maritime traders bought spices from the East Indies, or what we now call Indonesia, including pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, and turmeric. Another spur connected the route to India, which fattened the spice trade and added precious stones, cotton, and sugar. Cloths, ceramics, pottery, metalwares, glass, beads, incense, rare woods and spices, pearls, and coral were traded all alongside common goods and have been found in archaeological sites all over the Indian coast. Necessities also crossed vast distances and diffused knowledge and products. Rice growing, which was slowly spread from East Asia, was adopted in Egypt, in Morocco, and eventually in southern Spain. Cotton was introduced from India to Iraq as early as the 600s, thence to Syria, Cyprus, Sicily, Tunisia, Morocco, and Spain, and then to the Nile Valley, where it transformed the Egyptian economy. Along these trade routes, Europeans got paper making from China, as well as a whole bunch of other inventions from China, and Greek medicine returned to a Europe that had lost it during the Dark Ages. By the 15th century, India was the central hinge for trade, and on the Indian coast, colonies of traders from an astonishing mix of places gathered to trade all sorts of luxury and necessity goods, and Indian manufacturing, especially of beautiful and practical cloths, boomed. It was not only goods that spread across these transcontinental and oceanic highways, but also people, and with them their cultures. For example, a major story of the classical era in world history is the spread of religions. Between 600 and 300 BCE, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism spread across the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia. Pilgrims and missionaries' travel accounts tell about journeys in search of knowledge and to found religious communities, collect sacred texts, and visit shrines. Sacred texts influenced languages, scripts, storytelling material, and deities were exchanged among Indians and Southeast Asians. Construction of temples influenced the arts and architecture. Merchant communities spread the religions more widely. By the time of the emergence of Islam in the 7th century CE, these trade networks connected China, the East Indies, and India to Persia, Arabia, Egypt, and the center of the former Roman Empire in the Mediterranean. When the first Arab converts conquered much of the Byzantine world, that is, Egypt and Syria in particular, and the Sassanid lands of Iran and Iraq, they took the existing networks and laid down very few new rules to govern commerce. Essentially, both the converted and those unconverted to Islam, mostly Jews and Christians, traded in places like Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, and Tashkent, and went about their business. And business was really good, especially as now, as a single power, the Islamic Caliphate could guarantee safe passage between two worlds, the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, previously split since the decline of the Roman Empire. With later extensions of the Muslim world, the networks of Hindu and other traders were welded to those of the West and the Near East, and commerce boomed. Ships and navigation in this period flourished during this time and made all this oceanic and maritime travel possible and trade possible, and inventions spreading with the circulation of goods and people. Arab ships called dhows, made of teak sewn of coconut fiber, carried triangular sails and stern rudders. They navigated with instruments like the Kamal and the Astrolabe, and pilots wrote exact records of their routes. Indian and Malay ships suited to their trading journeys and needed for protection can be seen on temple carvings. Bigger ships called Chinese junks, obviously originating in China, range in sizes from large to huge, and they were the major transportation vessels in the Indian Ocean. Their hulls had watertight compartments, stern rudders, comfortable apartments, and many masts with bamboo matting sails. The Chinese introduced the mariner's compass, an innovation that moved across the ocean toward the west, from Arabs to the Mediterranean and then to the Atlantic. Pilot charts, knowledge of astronomy, and use of mathematical geography led to maps using coordinates for cities and landmarks. Archaeology, travel accounts, and official records have filled in the picture of a time when trade flourished in the Indian Ocean and gradually drew many more regions into its orbit. So business spanned huge areas in this cosmopolitan world, and economics bolstered political power, leading to the rise and fall of mighty empires. Again, by the 15th century, the societies of Europe were peripheral players in all of this action, isolated at the westernmost edge of an Asian-centric system. Looking down from above, our alien invaders would most likely conclude that China ruled the world, and rightly so. In the 15th century, the Ming dynasty in China was restoring China's power after a long period of domination by the Mongols and decimation by the Black Plague, or the bubonic plague. Under the Emperor Yongle, China established its Confucius-based government, eliminated all signs of foreign rule, moved the capital to Beijing, restored farmland, rebuilt the infrastructure, planted supposedly 1 million trees, and built up the economy both domestically and in foreign trade. The Ming rulers were not shy about letting everyone in the region know and understand who was in charge. China's renewed stature was on display in the 28 years of maritime expeditions, beginning in 1405 by the famous Zheng He. The goal of these missions throughout the Indian Ocean, this expansion of this vast navy, the biggest wooden fleet of ships in the entire history of the world, was to assert China's prestige throughout the Indian Ocean world, not to conquer territory, spread Chinese culture, or even gain control over foreign markets. This expedition was to show everyone that China was the power in the Indian Ocean and hence in Asia. Now, our alien invaders would not even have ranked Europe as a second power position. That position would likely have gone to the Islamic world, which in the 15th century extended across North Africa and into Spain, and east into Central Asia, India, and beyond. Muslim power was diffused through 4 large land-based empires: the Safavid Empire in modern Iraq, the Mughal Empire in current-day India and Pakistan, and the Songhai Empire in West Africa, beginning in 1362. Also came the Ottoman Empire, centered in modern Turkey. Islam emerged in the 7th century, usually dated to 622 CE, founded by Muhammad in the western part of the Arabian Peninsula. This area, including Mecca and Medina, was a trading center, and Muhammad himself was a merchant. This is one of the factors that explains the incredible spread of Islam in just over a century, expanded from Arabia along the well-established trade routes. Trade facilitated religious and political power throughout the Middle East. So by 750 CE, Muslim rulers were in power from the westlands of India to the Iberian Peninsula, what would later become called Spain and Portugal. Arab traders came to dominate the oceans around the Arabian Peninsula and the seas around the Persian Gulf. In those light, fast ships called dhows, designed specifically to navigate the turbulent Indian Ocean and tributary waterways, they carried spices and silks from China and the Indies to Egypt and to Arab markets in exchange for manufactured items such as textiles. Slavery, too, was part of this great oceanic trade system. Political control then strengthened economic controls as the Islamic caliphates and later Islamic empires promoted trade and used the routes as a tax source. With the Asian heartland under the rule of multiple and shifting Islamic polities, trade continued then into the Mediterranean, but there was a new dynamic now of tension that had a profoundly political and religious dimension to it. We don't have time to go into this extremely important phenomenon, but beginning at the end of the 11th century and lasting for 200 years, there were a series of religious wars between the emerging European states and Muslim states called the Crusades. We'll return to this later on in the aftermath of this in this video when we discuss the emergence of Europe on the world stage. But by the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was emerging as the heart of the Islamic world. It was an empire which would last from the 15th century until 1918. It was founded by Turkic warriors from the Anatolian Peninsula. It was extremely diverse, this empire, culturally and religiously. It dominated trade in the Mediterranean and the Red Sea region. It was matched only by Ming China and the Incas in the Western Hemisphere in terms of its size and wealth. Ottoman sultans claimed the title of Caliph, and Turks claimed to be, quote, the strong sword of Islam. The Ottomans became the dominant power in the Middle East and would eventually conquer Constantinople in 1453, effectively ending the Christian Byzantine Empire, and then they laid siege to Vienna on their way up into Eastern Europe in 1529. With the capture of the Asian hub at Constantinople and its change to the Ottoman capital of Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire dominated the old, restored trade routes to Asia and had an understandably hostile attitude towards the Christian merchants of the Mediterranean after the Crusades. These tax routes, these ancient routes, were heavily taxed by the Ottoman Empire. And this was of paramount significance because if any single element bound this entire hemisphere from Europe to Japan together into one identifiable system, it was trade. Trade was the major, perhaps the major, factor connecting the unbelievably diverse cultures and civilizations of this giant mass that we call Asia. And this trade was an irresistible lure to the emerging powers of Europe, as we'll see shortly. The story you're going to read in chapter 22 is basically about how Europeans expanded into the Atlantic, Indian, and then Pacific Oceans, tapping into this ancient hemispheric system in ways that would disrupt and eventually begin to transform this part of the world between 1500 and 1800. But we are just at the beginning of this story. In the 15th century, the coming dramatic expansion of European power, wealth, and knowledge seemed highly unlikely, as the kingdoms and empires of Europe were populated by an insulated people, preoccupied with their own internal and seemingly endless wars. Europe was slowly recovering from a devastating epidemic of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which had killed nearly 1/3 of the population of Europe in the 14th century. A medieval, as opposed to a modern mindset, dominated European culture and society in the 15th century. To this point, Europeans had shown little interest in science and technology, at least compared with the rest of Asia. Their spiritual and intellectual leaders insisted that everything worth knowing was already available in ancient Greek and Roman texts or in the Bible. In fact, men who speculated too much in science could be prosecuted for heresy by the all-powerful Catholic Church. European Christians felt surrounded by the wealth and power of nearby Muslim empires. Across Middle Eurasia, the Ottoman Empire thrived, with Muslim traders and rulers benefiting from the dominance of Arabic as the language of law, commerce, government, and science. 15th century Christians felt themselves on the losing side of the struggle for the future of humanity. During the preceding three centuries, European crusaders suffered bloody and humiliating defeats in their botched attempts to capture and hold Jerusalem in a series of wars known as the Crusades. Even worse, during the 15th century, Ottoman forces invaded southeastern Europe, capturing the Greek city of Constantinople in 1453 and bringing a decisive end to the Byzantine Empire. Europe was also entering a transition period in the 15th century. Parts of Europe, particularly Italy, were experiencing a very conscious cultural awakening called the Renaissance. based on new classes of wealthy merchants, art patronage, and the rebirth of Greek and Roman culture. The development of the printing press immensely lowered the cost of book printing, and more people learned to read as new books became available to the more wealthy and leisured class. Much of this new literature were vivid accounts of the wealth and power of India and China, including the travel adventures of Marco Polo. And inspired by these fantasies, European visionaries dreamed of traveling to the Far East to enlist their peoples and wealth in a climactic crusade against Islam. Furthermore, this flowering of culture included a whole new boom in the demand for luxury goods, for food, for porcelain, for china, for spices, for everything that the Asian markets promised to Europeans. Among European leaders, there was a powerful desire to break out and circumvent the Muslim world, especially out of the belief that Muslim power fed upon the wealth generated by their control of the trade routes of Asia. By paying premium prices to Muslim merchants for gold and ivory of sub-Saharan Africa and for the silks, gems, and spices of Asia, European consumers enriched the Islamic world while draining the wealth from Christendom. European expansionist leaders could find hope to the southwest, on the Iberian Peninsula, where the kingdoms of Aragon, Castile, and Portugal were gradually rolling back the Muslim Moors during a period of wars known as the Reconquista. In 1469, the marriage of Queen Isabella and Prince Ferdinand united Aragon and Castile to create the new kingdom of Spain. Zealous, able, and expansionist, Isabella and Ferdinand in 1492 completed the Reconquista, or the reconquest of Spain, by seizing Granada, the last Muslim principality in the Iberian Peninsula. They also looked westward into the Atlantic for new opportunities to extend their crusade. Close to Africa and facing the Atlantic, Portugal and Spain were well situated to lead the maritime expansion of Europe. In addition, the lifelong and violent Reconquista, which was a product of the Crusader centuries, had institutionalized a crusading spirit in Iberia, developing an especially militant clergy and an ambitious warrior class known as the Hidalgos, the two groups that would ultimately spearhead the conquest of the Americas. For maritime exploration and trade, the Spanish and Portuguese found reinforcements by welcoming Italian immigrants, especially merchants and mariners from Genoa, who included one Christopher Columbus. Okay, now finally, it's time to switch around and take a look at the other half of the world, separated for 15,000 years from the Eastern Hemisphere. It is the Western Hemisphere. So what was the situation of the Western Hemisphere before 1492? Before we get launching into this, I'll start you off with the second quiz question for quiz number 1. And that's based on this video also, which is, what are some important similarities and differences between the powers and societies on the Eastern Hemisphere that we just looked at in the video, especially in Europe, and the cultures and peoples on the Western Hemisphere, which we're about to look at right now? The people in the Western Hemisphere are sometimes referred to, as the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. So, who were the indigenous peoples of the Americas? That is, who were the peoples originally living in North and South America in the Western Hemisphere? When Europeans begin arriving in 1492, they will frequently describe the Americas as virgin land, that is, empty land, that is, unused land, ready for Europeans to colonize, to settle upon, and to use for its natural resources. But of course, the Americas, North and South America, were not empty at all. By the 15th century, the Americas, what Europeans would later call inaccurately the New World, were inhabited by a bewildering array of societies, empires, tribes, kings, soldiers, slaves, priests, farmers, and so on and so on. Like the societies of the Eastern Hemisphere, the Americas was an ancient world. It was also a world full of people. Over the past decades, archaeology and other scholarship has demonstrated that the Americas were a densely populated part of the world. By 1491, the population of the Americas is estimated at perhaps 100 million people, 20% of which were living in North America. These large and growing populations have been attributed to two major factors. First, a relatively disease-free environment, and second, a nutritious diet. Right away, anyone who attempts to speak about, especially in general terms that we are, to speak about the original inhabitants of the Americas quickly runs into a sort of linguistic quicksand. The most well-known problem is the use of the term Indian to describe all the people living in the Western Hemisphere. And this problem was meant to be solved in the 1960s and 1970s by the adoption of the term Native American. Historically speaking, both Native American and Indian are extremely remote from the way that America's first peoples thought about themselves. The immense continents of North and South America offered extraordinary climatic and environmental diversity. Peoples living along the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, in the Great Plains, in the Rocky Mountains, in the interior deserts, on the edges of the Canadian Arctic, or in temperate forests had to pursue different strategies for survival and adapt to different cycles and sets of plants and animals. As this happened, Indian groups became distinguished culturally, developing different languages, rituals, mythic stories, kinship systems, and survival strategies. The people of just North America spoke at least 375 distinct languages by 1491. And then the process of differentiation proceeded most elaborately in the Pacific Northwest and California, reflecting the great differences in environment. In this area, along the California and North American coast, West Coast, by the time of the encounter, there were 500 culturally diverse communities speaking 50 distinct languages. But cultural differentiation like this did not mean isolation. So just as in the Eastern Hemisphere, trade networks developed over vast distances. Archaeologists have found evidence of items moving hundreds, even thousands of miles across these two continents. In the Americas, we find before 1492 urbanization, migration, vigorous communication, and trade across in linguistic lines. Mesoamerica, for example, was for a millennia a cultural hub from which people migrated north and south. And it was here in Mesoamerica, that is Middle America, the Middle Americas, that revolutionary events took place. The first great cultivators of corn, for example, were the Maya, whose priest nobility class governed a large region of villages and cities in collusion with a distinct commercial class. The Mayan people developed art, architecture, sculpture, and painting, employing a variety of materials including gold and silver, which they mined and used for jewelry and sculpture, not so much for currency. Surrounded by rubber trees, they invented the rubber ball and court and ball games similar to modern soccer. Their achievements in mathematics and astronomy are most impressive. By 36 BCE, they had developed the concept of the number zero. They worked with numbers in the hundreds of millions and used extensive dating systems, making possible both their observations of the cosmos and their unique calendar that marked the passage of time well into the future. Modern astronomers have marveled at the accuracy of Mayan charts of the movements of the moon and planets, which were used to predict eclipses and other events. Mayan culture and science, as well as governmental and economic practices, were influential all throughout the region. So, for example, in the same area, roughly the same area, the Olmec were busy in the valley of what becomes Mexico, building the grand metropolis of Teotihuacan. In 1425, the Aztecs of Tenochtitlan formed a military alliance with numerous peoples, creating a triple alliance and then the foundations of the Mayan Empire, overthrowing a local people called the Tepanec, and then proceeding to wage war of conquest throughout the Valley of Mexico. The Aztecs' goal was to bring the peoples of Mexico under their tributary authority, and the Aztecs built a mighty, mighty empire that would certainly catch the attention of our alien invaders in the 15th century, including the spectacular city of what becomes Mexico City in Central America. This was a city that when the Spanish arrived here, it dwarfed anything that the Spanish had back in Europe, even the biggest city of Seville. Another massive power in the region, in the Americas, was the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was located in the Andes Mountains in modern-day Chile and Peru. It drew inspiration from earlier Andean people like the Chavin, Moche, Mazca, and Chimu, and controlled over 25,000 miles, ruling over 10 million people. According to one scholar, the Inca controlled the largest empire in the world in 1491, larger than the Ming Dynasty, larger than the Ottoman Empire at its apex, the Songhay, and anything Europe had to offer. Unlike the Aztec, the Inca created a complex bureaucracy to govern and assimilate conquered peoples, and believed their emperor was a god ruling by divine right as the son of the sun. The state owned all land and resources, and the empire was developed into 80 provinces, each with their own governor. Subjects of the empire were grouped into units and ruled by local officials. Inspectors kept deep records and kept track of birth, deaths, marriages, taxes, and military services using a record-keeping system called quipu. So what you see right here are the quipu talking knots. This is not what you're seeing is not an item of clothing. It's not a headdress. It's a record-keeping system where the knots on these strings are basically a form of writing and a form of keeping records. So this is the Central and South America part of the Western Hemisphere. In North America, there were also urban centers. In present-day Illinois and Mississippi, so-called mound builders built substantial towns around central plazas that featured earthen pyramids topped by wooden temples doubling as residence of chiefs. The sun was considered the most important deity, of course, and there were elaborate rituals and human sacrifice, especially when a chief died. Local chiefs paid tribute to the paramount chief in a system of hierarchy. The largest and wealthiest of the ceremonial centers was Cahokia, located near the Mississippi River in Illinois, just east of St. Louis. Rising in the middle of a broad and fertile floodplain extending over 350 square miles. Developed between 900 CE and 1100 CE, Cahokia and its immediate suburbs covered about 6 square miles with a population of at least 10,000 and maybe could have been up to 40,000. At its smallest, Cahokia was the greatest Indian community north of Mexico. At its peak, it contained about 100 earthen temple and burial mounds and hundreds of thatched roof houses for commoners. The city was surrounded by a stockade, a wall of large posts 2 miles in circumference with watchtowers. Another structure called Woodhenge, named Woodhenge by archaeologists, seemed possibly to have been some kind of a calendar device. Now, as I hope you'll recognize, it's really dangerous to paint these diverse cultures with too broad a brush. Nevertheless, we can make some generalizations about cultural similarities across Native American populations in 1491 that are useful for understanding how and why they fared upon the arrival of Europeans. First of all, despite the advance of agriculture, many Native American cultures and economies, especially in North America, still depended on seasonal hunting and gathering, mixed in with some agriculture and some horticulture. That meant, in practice, that Indian groups and societies and cultures in the Americas needed a lot of room for roaming and for seasonal migration. Another similarity is that, broadly speaking, Indian societies were physically very healthy due to the high nutritional content of the 3 sister staples, that is, maize, or what we call corn, squash and potatoes, and beans, highly nutritious food crops that kept them physically healthy. And they were relatively disease-free in the Western Hemisphere, at least in comparison with the Eastern Hemisphere. None of the major diseases that are going to stricken the human race seem to have been here in the Western Hemisphere. Other similarities across North and South America, there had been no development of the wheel, very few beasts of burden, and very limited metalwork limited to copper and gold and silver, as opposed to iron. This meant very different kinds of economies that would contrast with the cultures and technologies and societies brought over by Europeans. Another cultural similarity across the Americas was the kind of concept of animism. That is, a spiritual, religious kind of thinking about the physical world. The majority of societies and cultures in the Americas were people who believed that all sort of natural elements were imbued with spirits, and that you could commune with the spirits. So there was a different kind of relationship between humans and the land than we see in Europe. Finally, very different ideas about the concept of ownership and particularly the concept of property. In particular, in the belief that the world was animated by spirits, there wasn't the same kind of idea that you could own nature. In particular, that you could privately, as an individual, own a piece of land. Groups in the Americas in general held land in communal trusteeship with philosophies about the use of the land, but not the same kind of idea of ownership that would arrive with more capitalist societies of Europe. So this is a very sketchy picture of the scene in the Americas on the cusp of 1492 and the major power centers in the Western Hemisphere. Before moving on to the final piece of this video, I just want to say one thing here about the title of this class, which is not really world history. Officially in the catalog, this class is called The History of World Civilizations. And it's this word civilization that I want to highlight for a moment right here and have you begin to think about this, because it's going to be extremely important for the cross-cultural interactions that we're about to study between Europeans and non-European cultures. So just think about the question, what does this mean? What does the word civilization mean? How do you define it? And more importantly, how is the concept of civilization used by people to order and describe the world? This is going to be particularly important because everywhere that Europeans go, they bring with them certain kind of concepts about what civilization means. And that includes religion, technology, economics, politics. And their concept of civilization, that is, who in the world are civilized and who are uncivilized, that concept is going to be shape their relations and their interactions with other peoples in the world. And nowhere in the story that we're going to study after 1500 is that more dramatic and more devastating than in the cross-cultural interactions that take place between Europeans and the people of North and South America. So now that we've had this brief whirlwind tour of the world before 1492, what comes next? As you know from the syllabus and Canvas, this week, week 2, is titled How the World Became a Thing. That is, we're going to be examining the origins of globalization, the beginnings of global interdependence. Our two big questions for this and the next 5 weeks focus on this theme of global beginnings. First, how did the process of globalization begin? And interlaced with this, in what specific ways were new global exchanges connected to the rise of European imperialism? These are the two overarching questions, and we'll be exploring them in conversations that we have on the discussion board for week 2, as well as in the writing that you do for the quiz, for quiz number 1.